Imagine being sent to fight a war you don't understand, in a country you've never seen, against an enemy who seems to disappear into the mountains every time you think you've won. Imagine watching an empire with one of the world's most powerful armies slowly lose control, not because it lacked tanks or helicopters, but because it underestimated the people it was fighting. For decades, the Soviet-Afghan War has been remembered as another Cold War battlefield. History books usually focus on military strategies, political decisions, and international rivalries. But beneath those headlines lies a different story, one told through forgotten diary entries, declassified intelligence files, eyewitness accounts, and the memories of ordinary people who found themselves trapped in one of the 20th century's most brutal conflicts. Some Soviet soldiers believed they were traveling to Afghanistan for a short peacekeeping mission. Many Afghan villagers had no idea why foreign troops had suddenly appeared in their valleys. Young Mujahideen fighters often had little military training, yet they would challenge one of the strongest armies on earth. Behind the scenes, intelligence agencies from multiple countries poured billions of dollars into a secret war that would reshape global politics for generations. This wasn't simply a conflict between two armies. It was a struggle fought across freezing mountain passes, hidden cave systems, isolated villages, and dangerous deserts where survival often depended more on local knowledge than military technology. Every valley concealed another story. Every mountain seemed to hide another ambush. And every family carried scars that would remain long after the fighting ended. Today, we're uncovering the untold stories behind the Soviet-Afghan War. These aren't the famous battles you've heard about before. These are the forgotten missions, impossible escapes, remarkable acts of courage, devastating mistakes, and extraordinary human experiences that rarely appear in documentaries or history classrooms. Some of these stories were hidden inside Soviet archives for decades. Others survived only because those who lived through them refused to let them disappear. To understand how these remarkable stories unfolded, we first need to go back to the late 1970s, when Afghanistan became the center of one of the Cold War's most dangerous confrontations. At that time, few people realized that the decisions being made in Moscow, Washington, Islamabad, and Kabul would eventually change not only Afghanistan, but the entire world. In 1978, Afghanistan experienced the Saur Revolution, when the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan seized power in a military coup. The new communist government immediately introduced sweeping reforms, including land redistribution, changes to traditional tribal authority, and expanded rights for women. While these policies appeared progressive on paper, many rural communities viewed them as an attack on centuries-old customs and religious traditions. Resistance spread rapidly across the countryside, and armed rebellions erupted in multiple provinces. As violence escalated, the Afghan government struggled to maintain control. Officials in Kabul repeatedly requested military assistance from the Soviet Union. At first, Soviet leaders hesitated. They understood that intervening directly could trap them in a prolonged conflict. But by late 1979, fearing the collapse of a neighboring communist government, and the possibility of growing Western influence near its southern border, the Kremlin made a decision that would alter history. On the night of December 24, 1979, thousands of Soviet troops crossed into Afghanistan. Within days, elite Soviet special forces launched Operation Storm 333, one of the most daring covert operations of the Cold War. Their objective was clear: eliminate Afghan President Hafizullah Amin and install a new leader loyal to Moscow. The operation succeeded in only a matter of hours. From the Soviet perspective, the mission appeared flawless. But what they believed would be a quick intervention had only just begun. None of them could have imagined that this war would last nearly a decade, claim hundreds of thousands of lives, cost billions of dollars, and ultimately become one of the key events that weakened the Soviet Union. For Soviet commanders, the operation looked like a complete success. Kabul had been secured. Key government buildings were under control. A new Afghan leader, Babrak Karmal, was placed in power, and Moscow believed the resistance would collapse within weeks. Many Soviet officers confidently predicted that most of their troops would return home before the year was over. They couldn't have been more wrong. Beyond the capital, Afghanistan was an entirely different world. Towering mountains divided the country into isolated valleys where local tribes had defended their land against foreign invaders for centuries. Roads were few, maps were often inaccurate, and many villages could only be reached on foot or by mule. Soviet tanks and armored vehicles dominated open terrain, but they struggled in the narrow mountain passes where a handful of determined fighters could stop an entire military convoy. One of the earliest lessons came from the Solong Pass, the vital route connecting northern Afghanistan to Kabul. Every convoy carrying fuel, ammunition, and food had to travel through this narrow corridor. Mujahideen fighters quickly realized they didn't need to defeat the Soviet army in open battle. Instead, they only needed to destroy bridges, block roads with landslides, or ambush supply convoys. Every successful attack delayed reinforcements and stretched Soviet logistics even further. The Mujahideen had no unified army, no standard uniforms, and very little heavy equipment. Many were farmers, shepherds, students, or village elders who had never received formal military training. What they did possess was something the Soviets underestimated from the very beginning: an intimate knowledge of Afghanistan's unforgiving landscape. A Soviet patrol might spend days searching a valley, convinced they had surrounded the enemy. Then, just as they relaxed, gunfire would erupt from cliffs hundreds of meters above them. Within minutes, the attackers disappeared into hidden trails known only to local villagers. By the time helicopters arrived, there was often no one left to find. For many young Soviet conscripts, Afghanistan became a nightmare unlike anything they had imagined. Most had grown up in cities across the Soviet Union, and had never experienced combat. They expected to defend socialism against organized military forces. Instead, they found themselves fighting an enemy they could rarely see. Letters sent home revealed growing frustration. Soldiers described endless patrols through barren mountains, constant fear of roadside ambushes, and the emotional strain of never knowing who was friend or foe. During the day, villagers might smile and offer tea. That same night, some of those villages became safe havens for resistance fighters. Trust became almost impossible. Yet the untold stories of this war were not limited to soldiers. Entire Afghan families were trapped between two worlds. Refusing to help the Mujahideen could lead to accusations of collaborating with Soviet forces. Assisting Soviet troops could result in deadly retaliation from insurgents. For countless civilians, survival meant making impossible choices every single day. One elderly shepherd later recalled how he guided Soviet soldiers safely across a mountain trail during 1 week, only to secretly lead Mujahideen fighters through the same route days later. His loyalty wasn't to either side. It was to keeping his family alive. These stories rarely appear in military history books, but they reveal an uncomfortable truth. In Afghanistan, survival often depended less on ideology than on adaptation. As the months passed, Soviet commanders realized this would not be a short intervention. Casualties continued to rise. Helicopters were being shot down more frequently. Convoys required larger escorts. Entire battalions were tied up protecting supply routes instead of pursuing insurgents. Back in Moscow, officials publicly claimed everything was under control. Privately, many military leaders already feared they had entered a war with no clear path to victory. And while Soviet troops struggled in the mountains, another operation was quietly beginning thousands of miles away, one that would transform the conflict into one of the largest covert wars in modern history. The Central Intelligence Agency had been watching Afghanistan closely. Soon, millions of dollars worth of weapons, training, and equipment would begin flowing across the border, changing the balance of the war in ways almost no one could have predicted. The CIA had supported covert operations before, but Afghanistan would become one of the most ambitious intelligence campaigns in modern history. Behind closed doors in Washington, officials feared that if the Soviet Union secured Afghanistan, its influence could expand deeper into South Asia and the Persian Gulf. Rather than confronting Soviet forces directly, the United States chose another strategy: support those already fighting them. This secret program became known as Operation Cyclone. At first, the assistance was relatively modest. Small shipments of rifles, ammunition, medical supplies, and communication equipment began moving through neighboring Pakistan. But as the war intensified, so did the scale of the operation. Funding increased dramatically, eventually reaching billions of dollars over the course of the conflict. Saudi Arabia matched much of the American financial support, while Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, or IC, became the primary channel for distributing weapons and training to Afghan resistance groups. Yet even this tells only part of the story. Most Mujahideen fighters never met an American officer. Many had no idea where their weapons originated. They simply knew that new equipment kept arriving across the mountains. To them, survival mattered far more than geopolitics. Among the most famous weapons introduced during the war was the American-made FIM-92 Stinger missile. Before its arrival, Soviet helicopter pilots dominated the battlefield. The Mi-24 Hind attack helicopter had earned a terrifying reputation. Armed with rockets, heavy machine guns, and capable of carrying assault troops, it became one of the Soviet Union's most feared weapons. Afghan villagers often described hearing its rotors long before they saw it, knowing that an airstrike could follow within minutes. For years, Soviet air power gave Moscow a decisive advantage. Then everything changed. In 1986, selected Mujahideen units began receiving Stinger missiles. Unlike older anti-aircraft weapons, the Stinger could lock onto an aircraft's heat signature. Suddenly, helicopters that once flew with confidence had to operate under constant threat. Pilots were forced to fly higher, maneuver differently, and abandon certain missions altogether. One Soviet helicopter pilot later admitted that the psychological impact was almost as devastating as the physical losses. Before the Stinger, crews feared enemy gunfire. Afterwards, they feared an invisible missile that could appear without warning. But while new weapons shifted the balance of power, Afghanistan itself remained the greatest challenge. Soviet troops often captured villages during the day, only to find them abandoned by nightfall. Mujahideen fighters avoided conventional battles whenever possible. Instead, they relied on classic guerrilla tactics: hit quickly, disappear into the mountains, and force the enemy to waste time and resources searching empty valleys. The Panjshir Valley became one of the most remarkable examples of this strategy. Hidden deep within the Hindu Kush Mountains, the valley was defended by Ahmad Shah Massoud, a commander who would later earn the nickname the Lion of Panjshir. Massoud understood that defeating the Soviet army outright was impossible. Instead, he focused on exhausting it. The Soviets launched repeated offensives into the valley, deploying thousands of soldiers, artillery units, helicopters, and armored vehicles. Entire mountain slopes shook under bombardment. Villages were destroyed. Roads were mined. Bridges collapsed. Again and again, Soviet commanders announced victory. And again, after Soviet forces withdrew, Massoud's fighters quietly returned. His network of observation posts stretched across the mountains. Local villagers acted as lookouts, warning fighters whenever Soviet columns approached. Supplies were hidden inside caves. Command posts were concealed beneath rocky hillsides. Every attack became a deadly puzzle for Soviet planners. One Soviet officer reportedly remarked that capturing Panjshir felt like trying to hold water in your hands. Every time they believed they had secured the valley, resistance slipped away, only to reappear somewhere else. The resilience of these fighters began attracting volunteers from beyond Afghanistan's borders. Some arrived from neighboring countries. Others traveled from much farther away, believing they were joining a religious struggle against a foreign occupation. Few realized that these international networks would later evolve into organizations with consequences reaching far beyond Afghanistan itself. At the time, however, few policymakers fully understood what was taking shape. Their immediate objective remained clear: make Afghanistan so costly that the Soviet Union would eventually abandon the war. That strategy was beginning to work. But the greatest damage was not only happening on the battlefield. It was unfolding inside the Soviet Union itself. Continue.
The pressure was no longer confined to Afghanistan's mountains. It was beginning to shake the foundations of the Soviet Union itself. Every month, more soldiers returned home in zinc coffins. Thousands came back with permanent injuries, while countless others carried psychological scars that would remain hidden for years. Families who had once believed their sons were serving in a short mission slowly realized the war had no clear end. Inside the Soviet Union, officials continued describing the campaign as an international duty, but ordinary citizens were beginning to question the growing human and economic cost. Maintaining nearly 100,000 troops in Afghanistan year after year demanded enormous resources. Fuel, aircraft, ammunition, medical supplies, and constant troop rotations placed increasing strain on an economy that was already slowing down. Meanwhile, the war left Afghanistan devastated. Entire villages were destroyed during military operations. Millions of civilians fled their homes, seeking refuge in Pakistan and Iran, creating one of the largest refugee crises of the 20th century. Families were separated, farmland was abandoned, and countless children grew up knowing nothing except conflict. For many Afghans, survival became a daily struggle rather than a long-term hope. By the mid-1980s, Soviet leaders quietly accepted what many commanders had already understood. Military superiority alone could not secure victory. Every district they occupied demanded more troops. Every convoy required heavier protection. Every successful operation was followed by another uprising somewhere else. Afghanistan had become exactly what Soviet planners had hoped to avoid: a long, exhausting war with no decisive battlefield victory. Then, in 1985, a new Soviet leader came to power. Mikhail Gorbachev inherited not only a struggling economy but also an increasingly unpopular war. Unlike some of his predecessors, Gorbachev openly admitted that Afghanistan had become a bleeding wound. Continuing the conflict indefinitely was no longer an option. Negotiations slowly began behind the scenes. Diplomatic efforts involving the United Nations, Pakistan, the United States, and the Soviet Union eventually produced the Geneva Accords in 1988. The agreement established a timetable for the withdrawal of Soviet forces. The retreat was carefully organized but remained dangerous until the very end. Mujahideen attacks continued as Soviet convoys crossed mountain roads for the final time. Engineers dismantled military bases. Helicopters evacuated isolated outposts. Thousands of vehicles traveled north toward the Soviet border. On February 15, 1989, Lieutenant General Boris Gromov became the last commander of the Soviet Army to leave Afghanistan, crossing the Friendship Bridge into Soviet territory. After nearly 10 years of war, the Soviet military presence had officially ended. Yet peace did not follow. The Soviet withdrawal marked the end of one chapter, not the end of Afghanistan's suffering. The communist government in Kabul survived for a few more years before collapsing in 1992. Rival Mujahideen factions then turned their weapons against one another, plunging the country into a brutal civil war. Out of that chaos, the Taliban emerged during the mid-1990s, promising order after years of violence. At the same time, foreign fighters who had gained experience during the Soviet-Afghan War formed networks that would later influence conflicts far beyond Afghanistan, including the rise of Al-Qaeda. Looking back, historians often describe the Soviet-Afghan War as the Soviet Union's version of Vietnam. While the comparison is not perfect, both conflicts demonstrated the limits of military power against determined insurgencies fighting on familiar terrain. Both wars reshaped global politics and influenced future military strategy for decades. But beyond the politics and military analysis are the human stories that are too often forgotten. The young Soviet conscript who never understood why he was sent to Afghanistan. The Afghan farmer who spent years protecting his family while avoiding both sides of the conflict. The helicopter pilot who flew every mission knowing a missile could appear without warning. The village doctor who treated wounded civilians regardless of which side they belonged to. The child who grew up surrounded by war and never experienced a normal childhood. These people rarely appear in history books, yet they carried the greatest burden of the conflict. The Soviet-Afghan War officially lasted less than a decade, but its consequences continue to shape international politics even today. It altered the course of the Cold War, weakened one of the world's two superpowers, transformed Afghanistan for generations, and helped create conditions that influenced global events well into the 21st century. History often remembers wars through maps, casualty figures, and political speeches. But the true story of Afghanistan is found in the lives of ordinary people caught between powerful nations, competing ideologies, and endless conflict. Their experiences remind us that behind every military campaign are millions of individual lives forever changed by decisions made far from the battlefield. If we are to understand history honestly, we must remember not only how wars begin or how they end, but also the untold stories of those who lived through them. Those stories, more than anything else, reveal the real cost of war.
The Soviet Union entered Afghanistan believing it would restore stability in a matter of weeks. Instead, it became trapped in a conflict that lasted nearly a decade and left lasting consequences for both Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. Millions of civilians were displaced, hundreds of thousands lost their lives, and a generation grew up knowing little except war. The conflict reshaped global geopolitics, influenced the final years of the Cold War, and created conditions whose effects are still felt today. Yet beyond the battles, the politics, and the military strategies, the war is ultimately remembered through the experiences of ordinary people, soldiers far from home, families caught between opposing forces, and communities struggling to survive in impossible circumstances. Their stories remind us that history is not only written by governments and generals, but also by those who endure the consequences of war. If you found this untold chapter of history insightful, let us know in the comments which conflict or forgotten historical event you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoy well-researched documentaries that go beyond the headlines, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next journey through history.